It's time to address the big elephant in the room. Conflicts of interest are an unfortunate but unavoidably inherent part of motorsport governance. I said it. Kia ora, my name's Kimmy and I talk about Formula One in the world's second worst accent, and today I'm going to talk about two key things that both feed into the same point. One, the changes to the FIA's statutes that have now officially passed after a meeting of the Motorsport Assembly this past week, and how that will affect the governance of the organisation moving forward. And two, the race suspension of Warwick for making unauthorised comments to the media, and steps the FIA needs to take to improve the perception of Formula One race stewards to its ever-broadening audience. Both of these current news items overlap with a key problem that's kind of intrinsic to motorsport, which is the C word, and not that one. Conflict of interest. I'll get into why as I talk through the details, however for now what I'd like to say is remember that Formula One motorsport as a whole stands apart in a strange category whose only counterpart is really the likes of high performance sailing. That's another sport whose inherent nature is reliant on vast teams of people, most of whom are involved in the technological and logistical aspects rather than the sporting, and they exist largely outside of the regional and national identity that's commonplace in a majority of sporting environments. Not all, but a majority, and their nature is so incredibly complex that decision making isn't as simple as whether or not a ball crossed a line or someone threw a tackle too high or the impression of a foot wasn't quite in the right place. I know it sounds boring as fuck, but trust me. So first, let's get into these governance changes at the FIA and what that means going forward for the organisation. For a bit of background, most of you are probably already aware, but if you're not, Mohammed bin Sulayem, who is the current president of the FIA, has been slowly making changes within the organisation that affect both the internal governance as well as how those under its purview, such as drivers and team personnel, interact with the media. So this includes things like MBS putting himself in charge of the FIA Ethics Committee, which includes investigations into his own conduct and not just that of others, censoring competitors, particularly with regards to language used when acting in official media capacity, as well as placing restrictions on what competitors can and cannot say about both the FIA and current global political and social issues. The key changes that have been passed this week effectively boil down to the president of the FIA, aka the person who proposed these changes, being given power in appointing members of the FIA Senate, which is really the first step towards more cronyism than we've ever seen before, as well as being given the ultimate power to approve those who will run against him in this year's elections, under the guise of striking down anyone whose professional integrity can be called into question. So this is conflict of interest point number one. Is there anyone who MBS will deem suitable to run against him who has the appropriate skill set and depth of knowledge, who doesn't have some kind of conflict of interest within the categories the FIA oversees? I don't even really need to stop and consider the answer because it's no. There is probably no real credible candidate for FIA presidency who will not have some sort of direct connection to other people or teams that are governed by the organisation. And motorsport as a whole isn't segregated into FIA and non-FIA governed people or teams or even sponsors who never overlap or interact. There's always a little bit of overlap there, and just because you are hiring someone who came from, say, NASCAR, well, it doesn't mean they don't have sponsor connections that might be a conflict, or have worked for an FIA-governed team in the past, or don't have a relative driving in an FIA-governed category. To be able to head up the FIA effectively, part of the skill set required is an intrinsic knowledge of motorsport itself. Yeah, sure, an ex-CEO or a former politician or a highly experienced lawyer with no real understanding of how racing functions could put their hand up for the job, but they both lack the credibility to be elected, and if they were somehow chosen for the role, be facing a pretty difficult uphill battle from day one that would be hard to overcome. The role of FIA president requires someone who understands the inner workings of such a specialised category of sport, and to have that understanding, the person has to have worked in the environment in a high-level capacity at some point in their lives, probably for a pretty significant period of time. So by deciding to vet who he does and does not consider those with questionable integrity, Mohammed bin Sulayem, as the sitting FIA president, is providing the most apt and possibly the biggest example of what he's claiming to be trying to mitigate. Because what bigger conflict of interest is there than being allowed to choose one's own opponents? And as a side note, it's important to mention that he has also extended, as in brought forward, the cutoff for candidates to express their intent to run, purportedly to ensure there is time to vet them for suitability under this new extension of power. However, it's incredibly naive to think that this isn't specifically to give those who are considering submitting their candidacy much less time to prepare. Then we move on to Derek Warwick's one-race suspension from his stewarding role, and this is basically after committing what was effectively the same offence that Johnny Herbert was asked to step down over earlier in the year, providing personal opinion to the media about competitors whom they were tasked to make stewarding decisions on. This isn't clarifying the rules, this is what they think about certain drivers. Now, in both instances, the fact that Herbert and Warwick were speaking to betting sites that promote gambling on various sports that include the one they were presiding over as stewards. However, officially that's incidental in their punishment. It's a fact that continues to baffle the ever-loving shit out of me. But the issue with stewarding is the same issue as that of the FIA presidency. It's nigh on impossible to have effective stewards who are not baked into the culture of what they're refereeing. And I'll explain why in a minute. Then there's the added layer of the fact that a race weekend steward position is still effectively voluntary with only incidental payment, and it's kind of unreasonable to expect that these guys won't take a payday when the opportunity arises, particularly a big one like is reportedly the case with betting sites. Down the wrong way. Is it greed? Maybe in some instances, but like many sports people, a racing driver's career is usually pretty short, and unless they're decently successful and come out of it as millionaires or have a backup plan, they're still just trying to get by like the rest of us once their career's over. The difference is that they now have to go back to uni or be retrained in their 30s, and as somebody who's done that, I can tell you it's not easy. The opportunity should be and needs to be there for drivers with experience to take up positions where their knowledge and skills can be used to improve the sport. Because these are the best people to provide judgment on things that aren't nailed on penalties because they understand more about the nuance of what goes on behind the wheel. They understand what is and what isn't possible, what can be avoided, what's an incident where the best answer is shit happens, etc, etc. And every single one of these guys will have alliances and bias, and it is what it is. This isn't a sport where you can stick a career referee in the middle of a pitch who's not from either team's home country and call it a day. Conflict of interest, whether that be perceived or real, is unavoidable. The big issue arises when you don't pay them and don't treat the role like any other job, or for that matter, like any other professional umpire. Full-time, constant learning and improvement, studying both the regulations and past incidents and rulings and outcomes to better perform their roles and uphold the integrity of their position. Because the role of a steward doesn't just start and finish on a race weekend. And if it does, it shouldn't. Not paying what effectively amounts to a referee opens up the sport for a variety of problems. One's certainly been highlighted by Warwick and Herbert demonstrating how they feel about individuals to take a payday, but then you also have to ask other questions. And they're not very nice ones. Would a steward take an under-the-table payout from a competitor to penalise one driver over another should they be involved in a marginal incident? Would they consider manipulating a race outcome if approached with a big bucks payment from a gambling site? Would someone turn a blind eye to a certain driver or team because they're being considered for a paid role associated with one or the other or both? And I know the conflict of interest is an intrinsic part of the sport answer isn't something that everyone wants to hear. It's pretty fucking uncomfortable and it leaves a bad taste in many people's mouths. But it's something that needs to be worked with and understood, mitigated in ways that make sense, rather than pretending it doesn't exist and then getting mad when it's inevitably in the headlines again. Now, I would like to make it clear that I am not defending either Derek Warwick or Johnny Herbert here. I think both of them have made many lapses in judgment when either speaking to the media or, in the case of Herbert, acting in punditry roles. However, when the best candidates you have for stewards are the kind of people who will take money from gambling sites for a soundbite, even though they probably know the optics don't look good, then it's evident that the entire system needs to change, and that change needs to happen fast. So, Ben, if you're so hot on this whole conflict of interest thing and clearly aren't going to turn the mirror back on yourself and look inwards, I challenge you to do what's been so desperately needed for so long and spend some of that money you've been collecting from driver fines to start a proper professional stewarding program. I'm sure that every driver will be fucking thrilled to finally know what their goddamn money's going towards. Thank you so much for watching to the end. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel and just make sure you click the like button so YouTube shows you more of my stuff, because if you don't click it, you might not see me again. Thank you also to my patrons who are up here on the screen. Thank you so much, whānau. If you'd like to have your name up there in the credits and help a girl out keeping the heaters running, then the link's down in the description as well as right here on my boobs. Catch you next time. Ka kite.